This is Faith Still Seeking, a program about Christian theology. I believe, but I want to know more. I'm not a minister, I'm not a PhD, I'm just a layman, and I'm doing theology. Yeah, I definitely don't have it all figured out, but it's never stopped me from trying.
What the fuck am I doing here? Guess I'm looking for a place to be. I don't know what the hell to believe. I wish I had the answers up my sleeve.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Faith Still Seeking. I'm Kelly, and I am really excited to have some guests today. My friends from Quoir Publishing, Matthew Distefano and Keith Giles. They're the co-publishers at Quoir Publishing, which is an author-centered publishing company that focuses on some of the biggest questions in the universe. You might also recognize them from the Heretic Happy Hour podcast. They also are involved in Quoir Academy, which give you a little more information about that in the show notes here. Individually, they are both authors of many, many books. Keith is a former pastor and is currently a teacher and has written a bunch of books about, you might recognize the Jesus Un series. So Jesus is unbound in a number of different ways. And Matthew wrote the popular Heretic and Heretic 2. Also has done a lot of work in social work and now in farming, I hear. And anyway, they're both here today to talk about their new book that they co-authored, which is called Reading Romans Right, Correcting Common Misreadings, Restoring Paul's Original Intent. So after all that much ado, thank you guys for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us. It's exciting to be here to talk about this book, and especially this whole process of co-writing a book with Matthew was a lot of fun. So first time I've ever done that.
Yeah, how do you do that? I mean, I've done I've done a lot of collaborative work like in theater, but most of my writing has been a solitary venture. So how do you work together with somebody on a book?
Well, Matt's got more experience than I do, so I'll let.
It's interesting. Keith and I have worked together for like 8 years or whatever, and we've never written a book together. Though we've published many leather-bound books, and my office smells of rich mahogany as well. Wow. No, but I mean, this is our first book together, and each process has actually been different. I was just thinking as you were asking the question, I was like, I've written a book with Zach Parsons, who is a graphic designer, graphic artist. So that was like, I wrote the text and he created graphic art to go along with it. So that was one process. Mike Machuga and I have written multiple books together, and those were like conversations we had back and forth. Michelle Collins and I have done one called Learning to Float. And that was more like a therapy type session. And then Keith and I wrote, we kind of parsed it out in this book, Reading Romans Right, like, hey, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? How do we divide the book up and then iron it out to make it look? The challenge is to see if you can figure out who wrote what part. But we did have our own parts, and then we kind of just like, without ego and without, if Keith thought something should come out that I wrote, all right.
Well, most of this stuff about Kendrick Lamar.
Well, I couldn't help but make references to Kendrick Lamar, and he was like, hey, that's not going to play across. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. No, but I mean, when you're writing with someone, you have to go in like a true partnership. You have to go in thinking like, hey, this person's going to see things with a different lens and different eyes, and you got to go in knowing that and knowing that it's for the better.
Yeah, but there really wasn't a lot of other than the Kendrick Lamar thing. I don't think there was a lot for either one of us. There wasn't a lot of like correcting things or
there was just ironing out.
There was
back. There was just ironing out. And hey, how do we?
Yeah.
If Keith wrote a part that I had mentioned earlier, how do we like? If you got to like make connections from one place to the other, and that's just a part of the editing process. But as far as writing, like Keith was a joy. Keith, you're a joy to work with.
Oh, thank you. You are as well. It was one of the easiest books I've ever written in my life because I was really only writing half of a book.
Yeah.
I mean,
I can do that all the time.
Oh, I can do that all day.
That's why everywhere. I co-author.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So it was kind of cool because like we had decided ahead of time. You know, we identified we both wanted to write a book like this. We both had similar frustrations with the ways that we have seen the Book of Romans specifically misused and misquoted and misread and misunderstood. And so we just sat down and outlined it, you know, ahead of time. Like, well, we want to make sure we mention this and we talk about that. I mean, there's major things, right? Like chapter 1 and 2 in Romans, right? The whole like all the clobber passages. Things like predestination and that kind of stuff, and the universalist message of Romans, which I think is completely missed by almost everyone that I know that comments on Romans or quotes Romans, those kind of things. We just wanted to address those things. Also, like chapter 13, Romans 13, where I've heard it quoted, you know, even by politicians, you know, at press conferences to quote Romans 13 and say, this is why the Bible says, you know, you should just submit to the authorities.
Oh, yeah.
And just, you know, pledge allegiance to the state. Then don't worry about what's happening.
Kiss the ring.
You know, so there's so many issues with Romans specifically. And that's just a handful of them that we felt like we wanted to address. And I think probably one of the biggest things too for me was pointing out this prosopopoeia, which we'll get into that in a second. What is that? But like a couple of years ago, I was debating Dr. James White on biblical marriage.
Mm-hmm.
What is biblical marriage? And, you know, he's this conservative scholar guy who debates people all the time. And in the Q&A, the back and forth we were having after the debate was over, there was like a time where we kind of asked each other questions. And I asked him during the debate, have you heard of prosopopoeia? Do you even know what that is? And he said, no. And it just blew my mind. Like somebody who's, you know, studied and is quote unquote a doctor of mm-hmm. theology, had never heard of prosopopoeia. And anyway, so it's like, yeah, this is really something that, I mean, if someone like that doesn't know, the average Christian in the pew really doesn't know what that is. And understanding that is a big sort of key to unlock what's really happening in the book of Romans. So yeah, those are just some of the things that Matt and I wanted to bring out in the book. And what we did was identify those things. And then we decided, okay, well, you know, I want to handle this and you want to handle that. And we just kind of broke it up. And then I only had to write the parts that I was super passionate about. And Matt wrote the parts that he was really interested and passionate about. And Matt also did a really good job. In addition to writing, he was the one really kind of overseeing it and smoothing it out. Mm-hmm. Between, like he was saying, like stuff he had said and stuff I had said. I would write sections and send it to him, and then he would go in and smooth it out and like, okay, make sure this agrees with that. And I think also tried to specifically, and tell me if this is right, Matt, smooth out the language so that you really can't tell who wrote what, right? So
that was my goal. Yeah.
And I think most people can. My mom read the book, and the only places she caught there probably wasn't me was there's a few places where Matt gets a little salty.
I did notice the language gets a little spicy every now and again.
Like I think there's a place where it says Paul was a badass or something, and she goes, "Yeah, that was Matt."
To be fair, we quote David Bentley Hart a lot too, and there's no saltier, beautiful man than David Bentley Hart.
Yeah, that's true.
And that is you fanboy on David Bentley Hart as much as I do.
Yeah, I think most of the David Bentley Hart quotes, that's probably the clue that's probably me writing.
That's Keith. Keith is quoting David Bentley Hart all the time. I get a little more nerdy and like technical in the weeds. Yeah. So I kind of like I'll probably quote Campbell more than anything, and Keith will quote David Bentley Hart more than anything.
Yeah.
Well, as far as the salty language, you could definitely find it. You know, when you're talking about Paul and he's saying, you know, I wish those guys would just go castrate themselves.
That's Paul. I mean,
that's Paul. Yes, exactly.
So as far as, you know, one of the things that I really appreciated about this reading through it is when talking about Paul's complicated thinking, the ideas can kind of tumble out all on top of each other. And I think this book does a really good job of laying groundwork. And then, like first you have to know this, then you have to know this in order to understand the first thing. And particularly with some of the rhetorical devices and, and even something as simple as knowing that the original letter didn't have any chapter breaks in it. So
That's
that when you
also
read the
important.
beginning of chapter 2, it's the payoff to chapter 1. It's
That's
real
right.
easy to skip over that particular reveal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And we made a point in the book to point out that kind of thing in general. Like so I'm giving it away. This was something that I contributed to this, but I pointed out like an example of that kind of a thing is in the Gospels when it's I think at the beginning of the chapter where Jesus is and the disciples are in the temple and the woman puts in her her widow's mite or whatever, and Jesus says,
like
"Look at her,
2 cents."
Yeah, she's given all that she had," and blah blah blah. And when you artificially sort of break the text and you start a chapter at that story, then it makes it easier to assume that, oh, see, Jesus is telling you we should all be like this widow who gave all that she had. See, he's affirming her incredible faith. But if you recognize that there was not a break there, that actually that story is meant to sort of be an exclamation point to what he had just said earlier at the end of the previous chapter, because again, there were no chapter breaks originally. What's happening is he's sort of rebuking the Pharisees. He's telling people to be aware of them because they rob widows' houses and steal from them, from the poor, and they're these predatory people, that are not speaking for God and that are only care about money. And then you get the story about, see that woman over there who just gave everything. Then the story, the context is totally different. Now it's Jesus rebuking. It's an additional rebuke of like, and right here is an example of what I'm talking about, right? So that kind of thing is happening in Paul as well, where if you make these artificial chapter breaks, you can sort of think like, oh, this is a brand new thought. We're pivoting now. We're starting over from another story, but it's not, right? And so that's exactly what's happening in Romans 1 and 2. It's what's happening in Romans 11 and 12. It's a one continuous thing. And we get distracted by those chapter breaks and verses and things like that.
Well, and there's also a lot of theology that people bring to the book. Like when I was growing up, I already knew all about substitutionary atonement before I ever read a page of Romans. Like I had read it in, the Sunday school flyer or whatever. I knew about the sacrifice and, it was only later that I stopped to go like, wait a minute. So God's so mad that he needs to embody himself, to kill himself, to please himself,
to save us from himself.
Because his justice is like a rock so heavy he can't lift it. So, so a lot of people, when you read Romans with that lens, you kind of skip over a lot of the weirder stuff. Like, oh, it doesn't make sense. That's just biblical stuff. But I know the Romans road. I know like these 5, proof texts. And I'll be at your house next Saturday morning, banging on your door at 8:00 in the morning to ask if you're saved.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly proof texting kind of becomes, this is the problem of proof texting. Once we realize that in the Bible, like saying that there's like a plain reading of the text is just one way to read it. Like our way of reading Romans is just like elevates the text just as much as a fundamentalist. I would say elevates it more because it puts it in the context of like these were ancient rhetorical devices that Paul was employing. And so when you get to like the technical jargon, is Paul employing prosopopoeia? Perhaps, probably. And if he's not, it's some sort of precursor or some sort of similar technique. Like the point being is that Paul is, from a historical context, engaging in debates in the same way we debate now, in the same way, like if I were to write an article where I was breaking down a debate that I had, I would probably quote my opponent sarcastically and maybe I'd strawman him a little bit. and maybe I would paint him in a certain light. And that's what Paul does to the literal false teachers in Rome trying to preach a different kind of gospel. The same thing's happening in Galatians. That's why he's so mad. That's why he says, like, if you want to snip the tip and force people to do it, you might as well castrate yourself. That's why he's mad. And so, like, we can't, like, I've kind of moved on from a lot of theology, but this kind of stuff brings me back because it's important, because a lot of people really take this stuff seriously. So if we're going to take it seriously, we might as well read it in the right context and say, this is what's going on at the time.
Yeah.
Feels like I'm still faking it. Maybe that's okay. Who the hell am I supposed to be? Oh.
Yeah, I would also say to that, first of all, we know that prosopopoeia, which have we defined what that is?
No, you guys haven't defined it yet.
We should maybe define what that is before we keep going and keep talking about this. So prosopopoeia, what it is it was an argumentation device used by philosophers and writers, theologians, thinkers in the first century, and I think we even have a reference to that in the book. So it was a known way of arguing a point. Okay. So it wasn't something, Paul didn't invent this. And it's an argumentation technique where basically one person trying to make a point will speak in both voices, both in their own voice, and also in the voice of their opponent, right? Mm-hmm. And so the way I first heard this described, when I first heard about this, was that, like one voice could be Saul, meaning, Paul before, when he was a Pharisee, the Pharisee of Pharisees, right? As he describes himself. And so one voice is that Paul's very familiar with that voice, the voice of Saul the Pharisee, right? Who knew the law inside and out and blah, blah, blah. Versus the sort of Paul the apostle, who now has changed his mind about those things and sees something from a different perspective, right? This perspective of the gospel of grace and the kingdom and that kind of a thing. And so he's having this mock debate with sort of like this other version of himself, or these teachers of the law. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's happening in Romans. So, and it's not all through Romans, but there's two major sections where Paul slips into this prosopopoeia argumentation device. So here's why it becomes very difficult if you don't know that that's what Paul is doing. And I think this is how most people misread Paul today. Mm-hmm. They'll just open the book of Romans and they'll quote a verse, and they do this all the time. See, right there, Paul says, and they'll quote it and then close it. And it's like, right. Well, yeah, Paul did say that. Yes, it is in his letter to the Romans. However, if you don't realize that sometimes he's speaking in the voice of the teacher of the law who he wants to refute, and sometimes he's speaking in his own voice, making the case, the point that he really believes, then you end up quoting Romans and saying, Paul said, that's still true. Paul did say it. It is in Romans, but it's not the point he wants to make. It's not what he really believes. And he, in fact, wrote the book of Romans, the letter to the epistle of Romans, to correct those misunderstandings. And that's why it's really important to understand that. So like to Matt's point, you could still argue that, well, we don't know for a fact, because Paul nowhere says, by the way, I'm speaking in two different voices here, and here's what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. You just have to notice it. But so like Matt's giving the wiggle room of saying, well, maybe that's not what is happening, right? A lot of scholars do think that's what's happening. Douglas Campbell and David Bentley Hart and others, they would argue that that's what's happening. But I would argue that if that's not what's happening, Paul is a very confused man. Because he's schizophrenic. He says this one chapter, and then he turns around the next couple of verses and he totally contradicts what he just said. And then he'll turn back around and affirm it again. And then a few verses later, contradict it again. Like, why does he keep changing channels? So if you read Romans and you read it straight, you're either going to notice that he seems to be contradicting himself. Like, it's either that he generally can't make up his mind. Maybe he's thinking out loud. Or he really is trying to speak in these two different voices and make a point. And our feeling is that, along with other scholars, is that he is trying to make a point that's quite often the exact opposite of the point that most evangelical Christian scholars today have come away with.
Right. It's and the book does a really good job of really dramatizing the back and forth.
Yeah.
And I actually ran it through Speechify, so I was listening to it while I was like sanding the walls, so I could hear the voices going
cool.
back and forth. It reminds me a little bit. I mean, this is definitely a different time period, but of Shakespeare's version of Mark Antony in Julius Caesar, where he comes out and he gives the speech where he's praising Caesar, but he's like cutting him down every single line. He's like, "I'm not here to tell you that Caesar did all this terrible stuff. He's a good man, but he's a good man." And he's sort of debating with himself as well, while the audience is, they're ready to have a riot by the time he's done with his speech.
Yeah. And that's kind of what Paul's doing, especially like in Romans 1:18 through 32.
Yeah.
Like people like to point there, and as someone who's LGBTQ, they always go to the clobber passages 26 and 27. And when you step back and you think, and you see the big picture of what Paul's doing, it's like the list of things in that section is not what's important. Those come from Wisdom of Solomon 13 through 14. That's general anti-Gentile rhetoric that would have riled up the people who thought like this.
That's
so
what he's
that
doing.
They can get them all fired up.
And that's kind of like a pat list, right? Isn't that
right.
almost like
it's almost directly quoted from 13 and 14 in Wisdom of Solomon, which isn't in the Protestant Bible, but it's in the Catholic one. So that's kind of what is going on there. And then he gets to hit him with the therefore. Y'all are doing the same shit. So you're condemned. You're condemned. And so I'm not exactly sure what my point was in saying that, but that's just one reading of like you reading it plainly like evangelicals do. It's like getting the transcript of a comedian and then saying he's not funny, but you never get to the punchline. You got to read the whole thing, right?
Get to the punchline. Yeah. And especially in Romans 1 and 2, if you don't realize that chapter 1 is a setup for he's building a trap, and that as it's been, by the way, this was being read out loud, right, to someone. So he wrote the letter by a woman, by the way. He had a woman.
Phoebe, right?
Yes. Phoebe delivers the letter and stands up and reads the entire thing. So she's actually reading it. So you're hearing chapter 1. And so on purpose, he's wanting to provoke, because those are the people he wants to speak to. Those are the people in this church in Rome that are more likely to agree with these false teachers that he wants to refute. So he starts off in chapter 1 kind of getting those people like, man, this Paul guy, he's my kind of guy. We don't like these Gentiles. Oh, they're awful. They're horrible. Look at these disgusting, horrible things they're doing. And then chapter 2 is, and hey, if that's you.
But he also sandwiches in some things that would not have fit.
Yeah.
In between the anti-Gentile rhetoric.
Yeah.
So he does sandwich in some of the things that would have got him to be like, oh, whoa. And so.
Wait a minute. Yeah.
But then when he hits the punchline, like he says.
Yeah.
It's like the spiritual advisor who gets caught.
Yeah.
With, he's the anti-gay preacher. But he gets caught with gay porn. Yeah, it's the guy who speaks out against drag queens and grooming, and he gets caught with sex crimes, like Donald Trump's spiritual advisor.
Yes, yeah, it's that kind of thing.
Those guys are always telling themselves too. No, the one who's shouting the loudest, has the most skeletons in their closet.
That's who you should investigate. Yes. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's all we're saying is going on here. Is like it's almost the same thing. And Paul hasn't been in this church.
Yeah, he doesn't
know.
So
he's got to lay out this whole art. It's different than Galatians, which he founded. And he gets right to the point in Galatians, like, what the fuck is wrong with you? I told you what the gospel is, and you fell for some other bullshit. Now, this is why I'm pissed. Yeah. That's a different letter than Romans, which he has to say, okay, I have to make my case to a church I have not been to yet. And these other people, these false teachers, either are on their way or are already there preaching their bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he's got to head them off. Yeah.
He's got to come up. He's got to lay out this whole thing on why they're wrong and why his understanding is right.
Yeah.
So how does, for somebody who's not well schooled in these more academic points of view on Romans, how does this view of the gospel differ from kind of like the pop culture? I sin and then I kneel at the altar and I get saved. And
Yeah, I mean, initially, the first thing is that a lot of the wrath of God talk gets removed. Like you don't, as Paul understands it, that's the gospel that he's trying to refute. And so if you believe in a God that is going to bring hellfire and brimstone down upon you for being X, Y, and Z, gay, trans, whatever it is, like non-saved, Jewish, atheist, Muslim, that's not the God that Paul believed in. That's the God that Paul's trying to refute. So the great irony is that we add that back into Paul's gospel. And so that's just the first one. Like all that language is not a part of Paul's gospel.
Right. Yeah, that's why I think most people really miss, and this is one of my favorite things about one of the reasons I really wanted to co-write this book with Matt on Romans, was that in addition to this prosopopoeia, exactly what Matt just said, because Paul gets quoted a lot of times when he's using this sort of wrath language, right? As if Paul does believe that, but he's only quoting it to refute it. And everything leading up from really, I would say chapter 1, but leading up from the beginning of Romans to the end of chapter 11 is really Paul making a case for this God of grace, this God of mercy, this God, because he entertains the question early on in the beginning, about all Israel being saved. How can you say all Israel be saved when to this day so many reject Christ, right? So he sets out sort of answering that question in light of these people who believe in this wrath of God kind of story, and lays out, first of all, this. He argues this question of mercy and grace and wrath and forgiveness. But then he leads it down right to the final thing. And at the end of chapter 11, when he kind of brings it all, wraps it all in a bow, and has one of the most beautiful universalist statements about how God has consigned everyone to wrath so that he can show mercy to everyone. And the way that that's sort of his mic drop moment, like he's finally, everything has been leading up to that statement to make that incredible point. The way that he did it is, I always say, he does a little victory dance in the end zone. Right after he says that, he says, "Oh, the goodness of God, who can know the mind of God? He is, how amazing God is." He does this kind of worshipful, ecstatic praising of how incredible the goodness of God is. Why? Because he's just all this time argued the point so he could make the point that God's intention is that all shall be saved. And that's completely missing. I mean, I never was taught this growing up. But once you can see it, then it's like, I think once you show it to someone, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. And let me clarify, when it does even mention the wrath, it's wrath that we've stored up for ourselves.
Yes.
And that's what he says in chapter 2, like our hard and impenitent heart or impenetrate heart is what stores up wrath. Like it's what we continue to do as human beings. It's like we have the cycle of wrath. We have the cycle of vengeance. We have the cycle of retribution. And that's what we project onto God this whole time. But it's really us. It's us as countries. It's us as colonizers. It's us as white supremacists. It's us as racists, as misogynists, as homophobes. And we continue the cycle over and over throughout all of history.
One of the things that I've heard about Romans and about this kind of like sacrificial way of salvation, etc., is although that kind of traditional or popular view seems cruel, it does at least give God a sense of justice. And there are a lot of more conservative Christians who, when they hear about universalism, they're like, "Oh, how is that just? How can just everybody get saved?" Does Paul address that in Romans?
I don't think it's so much a specific question that he addresses. The only thing he does,
he does say that all fall short of the glory of God. So if we're talking about justice, like we all,
yes, we're all in the same boat.
We're all universally damned, right? By this logic of like, hey, we all fall short, so who are we to judge? We're all sinners.
Yeah,
we're all adding to our own wages of death.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've dealt with this question quite a bit, right? I wrote a book on Jesus Undefeated, which is about the doctrine of eternal conscious torment and arguing for universalism. And so that question has come up a lot in those kinds of debates and discussions. What I always want to point out is like, so when somebody says genuinely in response to this idea of universal salvation, like this, well, it doesn't feel like there's justice, you know what I mean? I'm saying, okay, what you're saying is you feel like that everyone should receive, you know, there should be some punishment, right? That people should be punished for their sins, right? Like, okay, so what you're saying is you hope that when you die, God tortures you for like 50 years before he lets you into the kingdom. Oh, no, not me. No, not me. I'm covered under the blood of the Lamb. So not you, but those other people, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, do you want mercy for everybody? Or mercy is only good when it's for you, right? Well, if mercy is for me, oh, man, I love God's mercy. God's mercy is so amazing. I love it for me. But when I see somebody else getting mercy, that guy didn't deserve that. Like, well, did you deserve it? The whole point of mercy is that you don't deserve it, right?
The unmerited favor, right?
Right. But I also want to point out too that in the biblical, I want to say biblical because it's not just an early Christian view. In the New Testament view of universal reconciliation, which was also believed for about 300 years by the early Christian church, not 100%, but I would say many will say a majority of church fathers embrace this view. It's not a view that says that, you know, ollie oxen free, everybody just goes straight, you know, you die, you go straight to heaven. They all taught this idea that everyone, in fact, Jesus says this, everyone will be salted with fire. Paul says that everyone will pass through the fire, and if there is any good in you, like gold and silver and precious stones, the fire will reveal it. But then he even says, if you pass through the fire and there's nothing, it's all burned up, there is absolutely nothing good in you, and yet they will be saved. So there is this metaphor of fire, whatever that is. Again, it's a metaphor, whatever that is. If you want to call that the justice part of it, right, there is going to be some amount of pain. It's going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be a process. I think the real problem comes when our view of justice is that it has to be retributive justice, right? Mm-hmm. I must beat you. I must torture you. You must feel pain. You must suffer. You must beg for it to stop, right? That's the kind of justice most of us have in our mind because we've been taught this way. We've been taught this is the way God is, right? But justice can also be restorative. It can be, and that's also uncomfortable. You know what I mean? To be faced with the reality of the pain that you caused another person, to actually recognize, oh my gosh, the awful, horrible things I have done, right? That's not comfortable either, but it's restorative. So I think it's a shift of recognizing that there is a fire, whatever that is, there is a process. It isn't comfortable, but in the end, everyone will pass through it. And however long it takes for all of us to go through whatever that process is, at the end of it is reconciliation.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I never thought about it that way. It reminds me a little bit of like the 12-step program, you know, when you get into like, now I'm going to do a fearless moral inventory and like make amends, which is different than just like I get forgiven.
Yeah, exactly.
At an altar and nobody else is involved. And
let's all just start over, everybody. Let's just reset the clock. Yeah.
Keith, that was brilliantly said. It's like when Christians talk about repentance, that's what we mean. As universalists, we mean that. Like you don't waltz into heaven, like he said.
Yeah.
When you're confronted with the fire, so to speak, and it causes that that makes you repent, that's justice.
Yes.
Because when you're repentant, you're truly sorry, you truly make amends, you truly make right what was wrong. In America, we would give reparations to the Black community.
Mhm.
That's what repentance would mean, and that would be a true form of justice. We can't undo what we did,
Right.
but we can make reparations and make amends so that there is some form of justice that we get to. That would be a justice of God in a universalist sense too. My question would be, what is just about eternal torment?
Right.
What is just about utter annihilation?
No.
There seems to be nothing just about that. Like, that just seems arbitrary, capricious, and it seems vengeful and supra retributive.
Mhm.
I can only do finite amount of bad, but infinite punishment always supersedes that. So what is just about that? It's not even retributive, really.
Right.
Right. Like how many million years do I need to burn for robbing a bank? Like, is
Right.
1 million good enough? Or
Right.
It's when infinite punishment is literally like a qualitative difference. You can't quantitatively get there.
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Always, it seems like God would have to come up with novel punishments along the way to keep it, keep it interesting.
And to squash the media of heaven, to say, hey, where have all my family members gone? Because there's going to be questions throughout eternity, like, hey, I was married for 40 years. Is my wife ever showing up here? And then he's got to say, you can't ask those kind of questions because, like, what kind of heaven is that?
Right. Yeah.
Like in this episode of Severance.
Yes. What wife? I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It seems like there's a lot of ways that you can trace these theologies to the impact that evangelicals and other who hold these theologies have in our society, our culture, our politics. Like, what are some of the ways that the misreading of Romans is having an impact in our day-to-day lives?
Well, Paul's got to be the worst culprit of, like, misinterpret. I mean, people love to misinterpret Jesus, but Paul really becomes a Calvinist favorite, like, right? Like, this very dualistic, this very split, this very vengeful God. We get the Jacob I have loved, Esau and I have hated. We get the clobber passages that literally oppress the LGBTQ community in Romans 1:27 and 26 and 27. And we get a God of wrath, and so if we're doing the will of God, we too can become wrathful. And so those, I mean, right now the people in power are Christian dominionists and Christian nationalists who love nothing more than oppressing the LGBTQ community and having a wrathful God, because then they themselves can be wrathful. And so I think things like, and that's, we're not trying to say Paul was perfect. We're just trying to liberate Paul from those misreadings that literally oppress people.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why we had Brandon Robertson write the foreword, because he's a queer activist who can speak to how Romans has been used to literally smack people over the head with.
Yep.
Right. Scare them out of hell or something.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I would also add too, because all those were great, but in addition to that, the Romans 13 thing, which again, if you guys remember during Trump's first term, I don't remember what the actual issue was, but the Attorney General literally quoted Romans 13 when asked by reporters about something that the president wanted to do, and he said, well, the Bible. That's why the Bible tells us to submit to governing authorities. Basically, shut up and don't ask questions. And I think that's another thing that, especially in a white Christian nationalist theocracy, Romans 13 gets weaponized to basically tell everybody, this is God's will, shut up. God is God. The government is God's servant, and everything we do is just, right? Even if it's not.
Right. They forgot that during a couple of presidencies.
Yes, I've noticed.
There's got to be a chart that, like, during Obama, the quoting of Romans 13 plummets.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot more people quoting Revelation at the time.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Exactly.
The Antichrist.
And
Yeah.
then chart the two, and I
You can see
guarantee
it crossing over. Yeah.
I guarantee there's a statistical correlation.
All right, everybody, switch back to Romans. Okay.
That's right.
Switch back to Revelation.
Now we submit again.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to ask is, early in the book, you guys talk about how a lot of this work has been largely confined to like seminaries, institutions, the academic circle. This isn't necessarily the reading of Romans that I would get if I had never seen a Bible and I pulled the Gideon out of the motel, dresser and started reading it.
Mhm.
I think this book does a good job of making these, making these ideas accessible for a lay person. But is there a problem with lay people just like going to the Bible themselves and studying it without having access to the scholarship?
I mean, yes and no. Like I'm like the lay people. I'm a lay person myself. Like I'm not a scholar, but I think you have.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have education and I did go to college, but it wasn't for theology per se, right?
Yeah.
But I think we have to trust scholars to some degree, right? We don't want to say that just because someone said it, even if it like counters my own experience, I have to believe what they said because they're an authority. I'm not saying that, but to some degree, we have to be very careful to say just because it's the Bible, we can approach a text that was written 2,000 years ago in a context not like ours, not written to us, that we can then interpret what it means. Like that's a bold claim because we wouldn't do that with any other ancient writing. We would not do that with Plato, Aristotle. We would not do that with Buddhist texts or Muslim texts. We just do it with the Bible, and that seems really irresponsible. So we do have to trust scholarship. And what we're trying to do is say we're not the first people to like try to make it accessible. There are some books out there, but some of these ideas, like I think historically, like the church, quote unquote, has fallen like 100 years behind scholarship generally. And to back to Keith, your point with talking to Dr. James White, the fact that he had not heard of Prosopopoia, and he had not heard of Douglas Campbell or the apocalyptic reading of Paul. It's not to say that Campbell et al. Are correct. Again, when we say right and wrong, we're not saying we're 100% correct 100% of the time that we're certain. It's simply to say, like, I mean, goodness, if you've not even heard of the most modern arguments, like, really, like N.T. Wright and Douglas Campbell are all having these arguments and they disagree with each other, but at least they all know the arguments. It seems really irresponsible to not even know the arguments and to say, well, they must be wrong though.
Right.
And so they're I think there's a balance and like we have to have our own experiences, our own interpretation of the text while also being in community like Keith and I have done and then also leaning on scholars and also having early reading teams and launch teams and people to give us feedback and a whole gamut of people write a book together. It's not just our names on the front.
Yeah. I would, in answer to that question, I would say, I mean, I understand on one level, like, the Bible is written to the common man and everyone should just be able to pick it up and read it and get something out of it. And yeah, on one level, I want to say I like that idea, but I know the reality is that no one really does that. And even if you try to do that totally in a vacuum, I think the average human being, not just even someone raised a Christian, just even someone, like you said, opening a Gideon Bible in the hotel room and just reading a random, chapter or something. Man, you need to know historical context. You need to know theological context, what's happened before, references to other verses and other things. What's going on, who wrote it, why,
what is
was the point they
Hellenism?
were trying to
what
make?
is the Hellenistic period? Like all
So
those
many
sort of
things. Like, for example, I heard somebody once describing like the Bible. It's not one book. I mean, that's part of the problem is that it is one book. Like you can have, you can grab one book and says Bible on the cover, but it's actually 66 different books written over thousands of years in different countries by different people, with different perspectives. And it's like someone said, it's like kind of like a newspaper, right? You get one newspaper, right? The New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
But we all know instinctively, without having to be told, that I don't read the front page the same way I read the want ads. And I don't read the sports section the same way I read the comics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't read the opinion section the same way I read, other listings. So that's just one newspaper. That's a newspaper, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the young people, they used to print these things called newspapers. Anyway.
My day.
But
there might be some in your parents' garage.
Yes, you might find a few things wrapped, glass are wrapped in them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Anyway. Yeah. And the Bible is like that times 10, because you need to really understand how to read certain things. And I would add, I feel like the Bible has been one of the most, it's not just Romans, right? By the way, this is going to be a series. We're going to approach other books of the Bible as well that we feel like have been mistaught and misunderstood.
And it won't just be us writing them. We're going to invite a bunch.
We're going to outsource to other scholars who want to tackle a book, because you know what I mean. Like, there's so many things. Like, here's one example, right? Like in 1 Timothy, when not Paul, but supposedly Paul, but again, you need to know this, that Paul probably didn't write 1 Timothy, even though it says that he did. But you need to know that, right? The Bible's not going to tell you that. But when whoever it is wrote in 1 Timothy, that women will be saved in childbearing, then you just take that as it's written. Like, you could believe, and I have sat under pastors and Bible teachers who would quote that verse and say that somehow women having children is going to save them. Like, what? That makes no sense, right? So, but to understand what it does mean, you have to understand the history. You need to understand the context, the region it was written in, the people it was written to. You need to understand something about Artemis worship because it was written in Ephesus, like all this kind of stuff, right? So a lot of the Bible is not plain, and a lot of it has been sometimes, honestly misunderstood by people who just are oblivious. But I think a lot of the times what I've noticed is that some of the specific ways that the scriptures have been misused and weaponized against other people feel intentional, because you can notice the kinds of verses that are used against women, against, the gay community,
against black folks during slavery.
Against black people during slavery, exactly. And even to the point of where, some translations, there are words that are translated the wrong way, like the word homosexual is in a lot of English Bibles, but the word homosexual doesn't belong there. That's not the translation of those words, right? So again, that's the problem reading an English translation of the Bible. And we've already mentioned also the thing about chapter breaks. So there's so many sort of tripwires and landmines to reading scripture that you need your eyes open, you need to be aware of. Otherwise, it's really difficult to understand what is exactly being said and why.
Don't know what I'm looking for, but I'm feeling better now. Got something to avow. I'm sick of the same shit. I'm moving on now. I guess I found some kind of purpose.
And I honestly, I don't think that there's a lot of, as you said, there is some malice, but there are a lot of well-meaning people who really just want to, I just want to know that I'm right with God and my soul is saved and my family's saved, who are teaching theologies that go beyond what's in the book. Or how do we get this scholarship in the hands of those folks?
You got to buy the book.
Well, that's kind of why we're writing.
Get a stack of them and start handing them out.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody listening knows a pastor or has a Bible teacher or a friend who really needs to read this book.
I was kind of semi-joking, but at the same time, this is why they ban books that scare them, because when it's important to have literature, no matter whether it's books, our book or other books, I mean, I could get meta and say, like, this is the importance of speaking out, and this is the importance of saying, hey, like, this has been used wrongly. We need to spread the word. This is how we stop bad theology and bad behavior and bad justifications for doing bad things. And sadly, and I grew up knowing clobber passages more than I knew. Like, how many, you don't ever hear pastors talking about, oh, Jesus was really anti-wealth.
Mm-hmm.
They really talked about being anti-wealth. And if they got money and they got a nice house, they don't talk about anti-wealth passages.
Nope.
But I guarantee you, I heard plenty of passages that it's not okay to have so-called homosexual feelings and things like that, and especially acting on them. And as someone who wasn't straight, those ones resonated with me. So this is used harmfully all the time. And it's not just our book. There's plenty of people doing good stuff and saying, like, but yeah, of course we're biased to say, like, yeah, read our book and pass it on. Like, this, for too long, look, Paul's not perfect, but for too long he's been used so far out of context that it's unfair. It's unfair. Mm-hmm. It's unfair to him as a writer, and it's unfair to the people that we're beaten over the head with the Bible with.
Right. Yeah. Right. And they've got 500 years of arguments, like from Luther on, that are like, there's, like little Bible tracts or whatever that have reduced the message to 5 bullet points.
Yes.
So it's great to have a resource like this, even if it's not somebody that you can give the book to at least like have a couple of those talking points.
Yes.
Yeah. Totally.
So if you're at Thanksgiving dinner, you can be like, hey, do you know about?
Yeah, I'm reading this really fascinating book, and did you know that Paul was using this? And it really changes the context. You should check it out.
Yeah,
yeah. But yeah, that's why we wrote this book, and I think honestly for myself and probably Matt as well, I know a lot of the books I've written have been trying to do exactly what we're talking about, right? Because I've studied something and I've realized something like, oh my gosh, no one told me that. I had no idea. And I write a book about it because I want the average person to know. So yeah, there's lots of other authors out there that are doing similar work like this, like Peter Enns, Dr. Jennifer Bird, Brad Jerzak. I mean, there are a lot of great people doing this kind of stuff, and we're trying to do this as well. But if like Matt said, he's not a scholar. I'm not a scholar. I don't have a seminary degree. But the thing is, we don't need seminary degrees to study this way and to find these answers, right? But we do need to read people who do know what they're talking about, right? So that does mean like reading Douglas Campbell or David Bentley Hart or other scholars. So you'd have to be really, really interested in this kind of stuff to really go deeper. And sometimes finding these books, they're very expensive. Maybe you can find one in a library if you're lucky, or something online. But the scholarship is out there. People can find it. It may just take some digging. But that's why we wrote this book. It's kind of like bringing the cookies down off the top shelf and wanting these kind of things to be accessible to people that are probably not going to take the time to read those scholarly books.
Right. Well, it's an amazing effort. And it reminds me what I've taken a few graduate theology classes. I haven't gotten a degree yet, but I'm amazed because I've had these questions like since I was a teenager, like very specific questions about this and that, and the pastors that I talked to along the way had no answers for it. But as soon as I open up this history of theology and I start going back to Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Anselm and those guys, I'm always amazed, like somebody else has grappled with this question somewhere in the last 2,000 years. It's there. All the information is there. You just got to be able to want to seek it. It's kind of like in marketing where you've got to, if the market's satisfied, you have to disrupt it a little bit in order to kind of open them up and be like, Walkmans are great, but have you heard about these iPods?
Yeah. And we're that's a good point, because we're primarily talking to Protestants, right? So there are like all these rich histories within Christianities, and that's a plural thing because there are many Christianities. And this is, I don't know, I'm sure Catholics and Orthodox have their own problems, But this way of reading Romans has primarily been a Protestant problem. And it seems that a lot of Protestants, like the Elisa Childers of the world, say like historic Christianity, and what they mean is like Jesus walked with Calvin or Jesus walked with Zwingli or Luther. And it's like,
right.
I think we need to go back further and like grapple with the fact that, like, I remember, and this is dating myself, but maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago, the first time I heard of like church elders in good standing with the church, all being universalists back in like the early church.
Mm-hmm.
That blew, am I allowed to cuss?
Yeah.
My fucking mind. And I was like, I remember being like, what the hell? Why we don't, in the Protestant tradition, we don't teach the history of Christian theology
No.
or
No.
the development of thought.
Nope.
Like how we got from point A to point B to point Z or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that blew my mind. And so it's things like that where it's like, we really need to take a step back in whatever faith tradition we are and say like, hey, this might be bigger than my little naive reading of what I first heard was the way to read the Bible, or what, like, we always have to be more expansive. And when we do, like, a fair reading of Christianity, there's plenty of critiques we can make, has to be a broad one because there are many different versions of this thing we call Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and it's I wish that in some cases that it would, rather than making people hold on to their own particular doctrine more tightly, that it would allow them to loosen their grip a little bit and be like, well, maybe, I may not have it all figured out. You may actually be right on a couple things.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to make that happen.
Well, our
just
addiction to certainty.
but...
Yeah, our addiction to certainty, especially evangelical Christians, they're all about certainty, and their faith is very shaky. That's why they have to convince themselves that they're right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means you don't ever entertain the possibility that I could learn something from someone else. I might be wrong about this, right? And that's a necessity to get into this kind of thing. Was Matt and I couldn't do anything. We couldn't write any books if we didn't approach everything from the perspective of, I might be wrong about something and I need to learn something new, right? Because I've changed my mind many, many times over the last 15, 20 years. And I'm trying to hold loosely to the things I believe. And I want to continue to be open, to, if I could be wrong, show me, let me learn something. And so if we remain in this position, this posture of learning, we'll probably have a better chance of maybe overcoming some of these challenges of like, no, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Like, well, do you believe the Bible or do you believe what someone told you the Bible said? That's really the problem, I think, for most of us.
And it's kind of the double meaning of our title, Reading Romans Right. Like, we're not saying we're 100% right. It's in the context of the fact that Keith wrote a whole damn book on not being certain. So
yeah,
we're not saying this is the quote unquote only right way, but we're also saying we're pretty confident that we have a good argument. So if you disagree, like, I think you have to refute our argument because it's pretty strong. And we're saying we're pretty sure that Calvinists aren't reading Romans right. Like, we're not saying we're totally right, but we are saying there's definitely a wrong way of doing it.
There is a wrong way. Yes.
Right.
And Calvinists are easy targets. Sorry.
Yeah.
So getting in the home stretch here, do you guys have any kind of like final words that you want to say to the listeners about Romans, about how they're approaching it, other than go buy the book, which is launching today, right?
Tomorrow, as we're recording it tomorrow, it comes out Tuesday, March 18th.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Wherever
I don't
books
know.
are sold.
Wherever, well, no, on Amazon. It's actually Amazon exclusive. The only thing I would say is that like we have a launch team. We've got like, I don't know what, 40 something people in the team, Matt, something like that. And one of the most rewarding things has been, because the book hasn't published yet, so we haven't heard from, we've only heard from the launch team. Mm-hmm. And the reactions from people, the reviews they've written have been really encouraging, because this is exactly what we wanted. Like people saying like, I feel like I can read Romans again. I feel like I can go back to Paul again, because I just basically had said, I'm going to close my Bible. I can't look at it anymore. I can't handle Paul anymore. I feel like, and so for a lot of our readers, it's given them a fresh perspective on Paul and on this book of Romans. And that's really all we wanted. So I think if you're someone listening and you have kind of given up on Paul and you kind of said, I'm done with, Romans or any of this kind of theology stuff. Because by the way, Matt and I were in that place too. So, to go back to suddenly realize like, there's actually a lot of redeeming stuff in Paul. Maybe we've misjudged him in some ways, in many ways. I think this book will be very, very liberating and very helpful.
Yeah, I echo that. And we're not trying to say that the Bible's not problematic, because it is.
Oh, it is.
And we're not trying to say that Paul is not problematic, because he might be.
Yeah.
But we are trying to say is, if we've misread him so poorly, like we've not just Calvinists, Protestants have made him out to be, then I think we do have two options. Either we've misread him, or that he really is not that valuable in terms of like how we should build our system of thought. Like, he's just all over the place. And at the end of the day, the Bible shouldn't be how we build our system of thought anyway. It's an ancient text, not written to us, but it's very valuable. It's probably perhaps the most valuable collection of texts of all time. So again, I think we want to hold these things loosely, where it's a valuable text and we want to approach it respectfully. But at the end of the day, you don't find your value and your worth from it. So if you're queer, if you're a woman and you just can't go there, don't go there.
Yeah.
Like, your value is not in how Paul thought of you.
That's right.
And it's not in how the Bible values you.
Yeah.
But we also don't want to let people just willy-nilly beat you over the head with that Bible, especially when it's so out of context. And that's what we think a lot of people have done.
Yeah.
And we're not going to just not put up a fight, because I've always wanted to write a book on Romans. I really have.
Yeah. Well, it's such an important book in the way a lot of people think about their relationship to God and even their relationship, even their own self-worth, that whole idea of like, oh, I'm a worthless sinner and I was born to die.
Yeah. I'm a wretch. I call that worm theology.
Yeah.
And we deal with that in the book as well. Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you to you guys for taking so much time today to be on the podcast, and thank you for writing this book. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's a great kind of like one volume sort of survey of a lot of scholarship that handles some problematic things in Romans. So I think it's really valuable. Anybody listening, again, it's called Reading Romans Right, Correcting Common Misreadings, Restoring Paul's Original Intent. And there's more information about it in the show notes. And thank you guys so much. Where can people find you if they want to hear you talk about more stuff?
Well, we do the podcast, Heretic Happy Hour, 3 times a week. And then I have a solo podcast called Second Cup with Keith. And my blog is keithgiles.com. My books are on Amazon, and I'm on all the socials. So,
yeah, I would just encourage everyone to subscribe to the Heretic Happy Hour. Whether you're on, Spotify or iTunes or any of the other platforms, wherever you're listening to this platform, go ahead and subscribe to Heretic Happy Hour and come check us out, and we'll talk to you a little bit and see if you like us.
It's a great idea. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Faith Still Seeking. To find out more about this program, go to faithstillseeking.com. To find out more about my work, you can find me at kellywilson.com. Our theme song, Purpose, is written and performed by musician Steve RX. You can find more of his music on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
I guess I found some kind of purpose.
If you've ever deconstructed your faith, you know it's not easy. But just imagine if you could have people to guide you through your process. People like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zand, Paul Young, and more. Well, if you head over to www.quoiracademy.com and register for Square 2 using the promo code RAD, you'll get 10% off the regular registration cost of this awesome course and community just for being a fan of our show.